Hello everyone, Kyle here from Web Dev Simplified. Today I'm going to be going through all of the exercises inside of my Learn SQL GitHub repository, so if you haven't already completed these exercises, pause the video now, click the link in the description, and make sure you go through all these exercises before going to this video. I have all of the exercises timestamped in the description for where I solve them and where I explain them, so make sure you check out the ones you get stuck on. Let's get started. The first exercise is to create a songs table, which is going to work very similarly to how we created the albums and the bands table inside of our Learn SQL in 60 Minutes video. We're going to start by writing out create table with the name of the table, which is going to be songs, and then inside of parentheses, we're going to put the different columns that we want. In our case, we want an ID column, which is going to be our primary key, so we'll make it a not null integer, and we'll make it auto increment. Our next column is going to be a name column, which is just going to be a not null string. So we'll use a varchar here. We'll make it 255 and not null. Next will be the length of the album, and this is going to be a length in minutes. So since songs can be less than a full minute or more than a full minute or some range in between, we're going to need to make this a floating point number. So we're going to use float as our type here, and also not null since the song has to have some form of length. Then we need a way to link this to the album. So we're going to use an album ID here, which is going to be our foreign key, and we'll just make this a not null integer as well. Next, we need to define our different keys. So our first key is going to be our primary key, which will be the ID column that we created earlier. And then we need to do our foreign key, and the foreign key is going to be our album ID, and this foreign key is going to reference the albums table on the ID column here. And now, if we run this query right here, we have created a songs table for our database. And we can see that if we open this up, go down to our record company, open up our tables and refresh, you'll see that we have our songs table here, which is exactly what we want. The next thing we need to do is insert all of the rest of the data for our project. So let's just open up this data here. We're going to copy all of these different insert rows that we've created. And I can just copy that in to a new SQL file, paste that, and run that. And that's going to add all of the data that we need into our database for our albums, songs, and bands that we're going to use for the rest of this exercises. I'll close out of that now that we don't need it anymore. And over here, we now have our second exercise, which is to select only the names of all of the different bands. And we need to change the name of the column that's being returned to be band name. So, in order to do this, it's going to be fairly straightforward. We can just do a simple select statement. And since we only want the name column, we can just select the name column. And we can tell we want it to be called band name. And then we just say where we want it to come from. So we want this to come from the bands table. And now if we run that, you'll see that we get all the different band names returned, which is exactly the same as the results over here inside of the GitHub repo. Now we can move on to the third task here, which is to select the oldest album. This is a bit more of a complex task since we need to now do some ordering and some filtering in order to get the album that is the oldest, but also make sure we don't return any albums that don't have a release year, because there are some albums in our database that don't have a release year. So first, we need to get our select statement written. And we just want to select everything from this album, so we'll say select star from albums. And then we want to say where the release year is not null, because we don't want to return an album that doesn't have a release year. So where release year is not null. And we need to order these by the release year so we can get the oldest one. So order by release year. And then since we only want to get one result back, we just use limit 1 in order to limit our results set to 1. And if you run that, you see that we now get the oldest album with a release year of 1988. If we, for example, wanted to get the newest album, we would just change our order by to be descending instead of ascending. And if we run that, you now see that we get the newest album, which is from 2018. Our next exercise that we need to complete is to get all of the names of the bands that have albums released. And we just want to get their name and nothing else. So, like it says in the solution, there are multiple ways to solve this problem, but I'm going to show you the simplest and smallest solution that we can use. The first thing we need to do is set up our select on the bands table. So we're going to do select, and since we know we want to get the name from the bands table, we'll say bands.name, and we know we need to call it band name as our title. and then from the bands table. So right here, we're getting all of the different band names, but we only want the band names where this band has albums. So we can use our inner join that we know about on bands. We can do it on bands.id equals albums.bandid. So this is going to get all the different albums that have a band ID that's the same as the band ID that's stored in the albums table as in the bands table. And if we run this, it's only going to return bands that actually have albums, since we're doing an inner join instead of a left join. And if you run that, you see we get all of our different names, but we get all of them duplicated, and we don't actually want all of the names duplicated. We just want the individual names one at a time. So in order to fix that, we can just add a distinct here. And now we're just going to get all the distinct results. And as you can see, our results over here look exactly the same as in the repository on the right. The next problem that we need to solve is to get all of the bands that have no albums, which is very similar to the problem that we just solved, but it's going to be a little bit more complicated. So let's remove this all and start from scratch. So we know we need to do the exact same thing to start. We need to get the band name, and we need to get it as band name, and we want to get this from the bands table. And then we need to do a join again on albums, but since we only want the bands with no albums, we need to do a left join so we can return bands that also don't have any album records. So we left join. We want to do this on the albums table, and we want to do it where the bands.id equals the albums.bandid, as we talked about in the last example. And then we need to group these by the band ID so we can determine which ones have albums and which ones don't. So we're just going to group by albums.bandid, and now all the different albums are going to be grouped into these different aggregates, which we can use our aggregate functions in order to count on in order to determine which ones have albums and which ones don't. So we can say having a count of albums.id that equals 0. And this essentially means if we group all the albums by band ID, we want to find all the groups where there's absolutely nothing in the group for a given band. And in that case, that would be the bands that have no albums. So if we run this, you see that the results we get back, we get the band name of Dream Theater because they're the only band in our database that has absolutely no albums assigned to them. So far, these last 5 problems have been pretty straightforward, but this 6th one is going to get a little bit more complicated than the last few. As it says, we need to get the longest album in our entire database, and we want to return the name of that album, the year that album was released, and the duration of that album. So, to get started, we know that we're going to need to be selecting things from the album table since all the information we're returning is based on the album. So we want to do a select, and we want to get the album's name, so albums.name, and then we need to return that as name. Then we want to get the release year, so albums.release year. We want to return that as release year. Next, we need to return the duration of the entire album, which essentially all that's saying is we want to get the length of all of the songs. So we can just do sum of the songs.length. So these will be all of the songs related to the album, and that will give us the duration of the album. And we can just say as duration. And I forgot to put a comma up here since we have to separate all of our different rows that we're selecting from commas. And there we go. Now we can say where we want to select from, which in our case, we want to select from the albums table, like I said, since this information is dependent upon the album. And then we needed to join to the songs table in order to get that duration for the songs. So we can do our join down here, join songs, and we want to join the songs on albums.id equals songs.albumid, just like we would do for the bands, but this case it's for different albums and songs. And then we can do our group by on the actual album ID. So this will get all of the albums for, or all of the songs, I'm sorry, for a single album grouped together. So group by songs.albumid. And now we have all of our different groups, and we want to order these different groups by the duration that we defined earlier. So we can just say order by, and since we alias this column as duration, we can just say duration down here, and it's going to order by the duration. And since we want the longest one first, we're going to use descending and then limit our result to 1 and this is going to return the longest album in our entire list. But before we run that, we need to look at this error we have up here, and it looks like I accidentally added an S to this join statement. It should be join instead of joins. So if we remove that and now we run it, you'll notice that we get the longest album in our entire database, the year it was released, and the duration of that album, which is exactly what we want. Next, we can move on to our other problem, which is going to be updating the release year of the album that does not have a release year in our database. In order to do this, we first need to figure out which albums in our database don't have a release year. So we can just do a select. We just select everything. We want to select from the albums table, and we want to select where the release year is null. So this is going to give us all of the rows that don't have any release year for their albums, and you'll see that the only album we get back is the Master of Puppets album because it has no release year. So now we need to update that release year. And it says right here that the release year should be 1986. So we can use an update statement. We say we want to update the albums table. We want to set the release year. And we want to set it equal to 1986, as the problem says. And the reason we did our select earlier is so we can get the ID that we want to set. So we can say where ID equals 4, because if we don't specify a where clause here, it's going to update every single album in our entire database to be 1986, but we only want to update this one album. And now if we run that, and we run this query up here again to get all the release years that are null, you'll see that we get nothing returned, which is perfect because that means that there are no albums left with no release year, so this update statement worked. Our next exercise is working on inserting data into the database, so we just need to insert our favorite band and album. And since I already have a lot of my favorite bands and albums in this database, I'm just going to pick something from my Spotify that I've been listening to recently and insert that in here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to write our insert statement for our band, because albums references bands, so we need to have a band before we can insert our album. So we'll say insert into bands, and we want to insert the name column because all the other columns are auto-generated, and we need to give it the values that we want to insert. And in my case, I'm going to insert band Haken, and if we run this command right here, we're going to get our band inserted. And then in order to check that our band was actually inserted, and to get the ID that we need to use for inserting our album, we can just do a select. We can select the ID from bands, and we can say we want to order by ID, descending, and we only want to get one result back. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to order our bands by ID and get the one with the highest ID and return it. And in that case, that should be the most recent band that we added, since it's auto incrementing every time. And if you run that, we get an ID of 8 back, which means we can use that ID of 8 to link our album to our band. To insert our album, we're going to do the same thing, insert into albums, and then we put the columns we want to insert, which will be name, release year, and the band ID that we just looked up. Then we tell it the values that we want to insert. In our case, it's going to be the album vector. It's going to have a release year of 2018, and the band ID is 8, just like we looked up. And now we can run that statement, and that has inserted the band into our table. And we can query up here the albums table instead, just get back everything. And if you query that, you see that our album was correctly inserted with the correct band ID, which is exactly what we want. Now looking at the 9th statement here for our exercises, this is going to be to delete the band and the album that we just added. And we can do this really easily, and we need to just keep in mind that we have to delete the album first, since the album references the band, and if we try to delete the band first, it'll now be referencing something that doesn't exist, and it'll throw an error. So let's remove everything that we have here, and we already have queried the album to get the ID of 19 for that album. So we can just do a simple delete from albums where the ID equals 19. And if we run that, we're going to no longer have that album there. And we can do the same thing for our band. So we can say delete from bands where ID, and in our case this ID was equal to 8. And now if we run this, we now have deleted that band and that album. And we can test that real simply by just doing a select from bands. There we go, and if we run that, you'll see that the band that we created is no longer inside of this bands list. And we can do the same thing for albums, if we run that, you'll see that the album is not at the bottom of this list either. This next example, number 10, just asks us to simply get the average length of all the songs and return it as average song duration. This is a fairly straightforward example, which is going to take advantage of aggregate functions. So what we want to do is we want to select, and we're going to be selecting from the songs table, but we want to select that average length. So we can just run the average aggregate function on the length column of our database, and we can return it as average song duration. And we just want to get that from the songs table, as I mentioned earlier. And if you run that, you see that we get the average song duration to be about a little over 5 minutes long, which is perfect, and that's fairly simple and straightforward, and is going to prepare us greatly for the next two problems that we have, which are a bit more complex. So we have the 11th problem down here, which is asking us to select the longest song off of each album, which is going to require us to do a bit of joining and grouping by in order to get this result. The first thing that we can do, set up all of our select statements for what we need to select. So we know that we want to select the album's name, and we want to return that as album. We also want to get the release year of that album, so we'll just get the release year here, and we need to return that as release year. And then lastly, we want to get the maximum song length, so we'll say max of songs.length, and we want to get that as duration. And again, I need to make sure I put the commas at the end of these different rows in order to signify that we're selecting multiple columns. And we need to do that from the albums table, since as I said, these values are dependent upon the albums. Next, we can join these on the songs table, and make sure I spelled join correctly. We want to do it where the albums.id is equal to the songs.albumid. There we go. And then in order to get the longest song, we need to group all of our songs by album ID so that each of these max songs.length is based upon the album that it's in. So we can just say group by songs.album ID, and if I run that, you'll see that we now get the longest song for all of our different albums listed out here, and it perfectly matches the list that we have over here on the right side. The last problem that we have to solve is to get the number of songs for each band, and this, in my opinion, is the toughest question on the entire list because it requires us to do multiple joins instead of just one. To get started, we want to do our select and get the different results that we want returned. In our case, we're going to be selecting the band's name, so we'll say bands.name. We just want to return this as band, and then our next column that we want to return is the number of songs for that band. So we'll say the count of songs.id, and we're going to return this as the number of songs. And there we go. And we want to select this from the bands table since these are dependent upon the band's record as opposed to any of the other records. So we'll just say from bands. And then this is where we need to do our multiple joins. So first, to get to the album or to get to the songs, we need to first join bands to albums and then albums to songs. So we'll say joins, and we'll joins on the albums table, and we'll do it where the bands.id equals the albums.bandid, and then we need to do the exact same thing but join the albums to the songs. So join songs on albums.id equals songs.albumid, and now this is linking from bands to albums and albums to songs, and then we have a bunch of different songs now, and we want to group all of these based on the band ID. So we'll just say group by albums.bandid, and now all of the songs for all of the albums are going to be grouped based on the band ID in the albums table, which means if one album for band 1 has 3 songs and another album for band 1 has 4 songs, it'll group both of those into the same grouping. So when we do our count, we're going to get 7 returned instead of 3 and 4. And now if we run that, you'll see that we get all of the number of songs over here for all of our different bands. And again, it matches up perfectly to the results that you see on the right side inside of the repository. I hope by walking through these different solutions that I'm able to help you guys through any of the solutions that you were stuck on and weren't able to figure out just by looking at the actual solution. If you guys do have any questions though, make sure to let me know in the comments down below. And also, if you enjoyed it, please make sure to like and subscribe for future content just like this. Thank you guys very much for watching. Have a good day.